Hey, this is Bunny. Today we're talking about one of my favorite subjects as both a dungeon master and someone who has spent an unreasonable amount of time painting tiny monsters that could absolutely ruin a party's afternoon. Specifically, we're talking about crafting quests that players actually care about. Not quests they politely complete because they're sitting at your table and you're all friends. I mean quests that make people lean forward in their chairs, forget to check their phones, start arguing strategy before you've even finished describing the situation, and accidentally stay an hour past the planned ending because they absolutely have to know what happens next. While we chat, I'm going to be painting this gloriously corrupted monstrosity, layering muddy browns onto the armor and flesh, because apparently every terrifying creature begins with something that looks suspiciously like chocolate pudding. One of the biggest misconceptions in tabletop gaming is that players only care about rewards. It's easy to think they'll chase anything if you promise enough gold, magic swords, or a fancy castle with suspicious plumbing. The truth is that players remember stories far longer than treasure. Ask someone about a campaign from 5 years ago, and they probably won't remember exactly how many platinum pieces they earned. They will absolutely remember Gary the Goblin, who accidentally became mayor, the goose that somehow survived 3 dragon attacks, or the bard who rolled so poorly that he flirted with a gelatinous cube. Human beings remember emotion, surprise, humor, and relationships. Gold buys potions. Memories buy another campaign. That means your first goal isn't designing a quest. It's designing curiosity. A quest that begins with the king offers 500 gold to clear some bandits might work perfectly well. There's nothing wrong with it. But compare it to every night the abandoned windmill lights its lantern, even though no one has lived there for 50 years. Suddenly people have questions. Who lights it? Why only at night? Why hasn't anyone investigated? Is it haunted? Is it a mimic? Everything is better if it's secretly a mimic. Curiosity pulls players forward voluntarily. They aren't chasing a reward anymore. They're chasing answers. And human beings have an incredibly difficult time walking away from unanswered questions. As I'm adding colors into the recesses of this miniature, it's reminding me that good questions also need shadows. Not literally, although spooky forests are wonderful. I mean unanswered spaces where players naturally begin inventing theories. Here's the fun secret. Your players will almost always imagine something more dramatic than what you originally planned. They'll convince themselves that the mysterious old baker is secretly an archmage, or that the missing chickens are part of an infernal conspiracy involving demonic poultry accountants. Half the time their theory is so much cooler that you quietly steal it. Congratulations! Your players just helped write your campaign while believing they were solving it. Another common mistake is assuming bigger automatically means better. New dungeon masters sometimes believe every adventure needs to threaten the entire world. By level 3, the party is already preventing the apocalypse before lunch, saving reality before dinner, and somehow still finding time to haggle over rope prices. That's exhausting. If every quest determines the fate of existence, well, eventually existence starts to feel like paperwork. Sometimes the most engaging adventure involves helping a lonely ghost deliver one final letter, or rescuing a village's beloved sheep that keeps wandering into suspiciously magical woods. Smaller stakes often create bigger emotional investment because players can actually see the people they're helping. Think about your favorite books, movies, or games. Chances are they aren't memorable simply because something exploded. They're memorable because somebody cared about somebody else. The explosion was just enthusiastic punctuation. Players are exactly the same. Give them a family trying to rebuild after monsters destroyed their farm. Give them a blacksmith desperately searching for an apprentice. Give them a child convinced the local swamp monster is actually lonely instead of evil. Suddenly, the quest isn't about defeating challenge rating number 7. It's about helping characters who feel like they belong in the world instead of existing solely to hand out experience points and dramatically point toward the next dungeon entrance. Let's talk villains for a moment, because villains are deliciously fun to create. Resist the temptation to make every antagonist an endlessly cackling bundle of pure evil. Sure, those villains have their place, especially if they're dramatically standing on cliffs during thunderstorms. But players often become much more invested when they understand why someone made terrible choices. Maybe the necromancer genuinely believes raising the dead is preventing families from experiencing grief. Maybe the bandit leader used to be the kingdom's greatest knight before politics ruined everything. Understanding isn't the same as agreeing, but complexity creates conversations, and conversations create memorable sessions that last far longer than another sword fight. Speaking of memorable things, I've started working other colors into the raised textures on this creature, and suddenly it's beginning to look ancient instead of merely muddy. Sort of. Miniatures are funny that way. One careful highlight and your horrifying blob transforms into an ancient horror with thousands of years of questionable life choices. Campaigns work similarly. Tiny details create enormous changes in perception. A cracked family portrait inside a dungeon tells a story. A rusted child's toy lying beside monster tracks tells another. Players notice far more environmental storytelling than we sometimes expect, especially when they're convinced every spoon is secretly an important clue. Here's another trick I absolutely love. Give quests consequences that continue existing after the adventure ends. If the players save a village, let them return months later and see children playing safely in the streets. If they ignore someone's plea for help, don't punish them out of spite, but let the world keep moving. Maybe another group solved the problem poorly. Maybe the town emptied. Maybe the problem grew. Players become invested when they realize their decisions permanently shape the setting instead of disappearing into the magical void where unfinished side quests apparently go to await retirement with all the missing socks from my house. Humor also deserves far more attention than it usually gets. Fantasy worlds can absolutely contain danger, tragedy, sacrifice, and impossible odds, but if everything is relentlessly serious, the emotional highs start feeling flat. Let the weird things happen. Let dwarves argue passionately over whose beard won an unofficial beauty contest. Let a wizard accidentally invent magical cheese that screams whenever someone slices it. Let a dragon insist on proper appointment scheduling before attacking adventurers. Laughter creates contrast, and contrast makes dramatic moments land much harder later. Besides, players will spend 3 sessions adopting the screaming cheese instead of following your carefully prepared plot. And honestly, that's on you. As I add more colors to this interesting creature I'm painting, this corrupted brute is finally beginning to tell a story instead of looking like an unpainted collection of unfortunate life decisions. That's exactly where great quests begin too. Before maps, before treasure tables, before carefully balanced encounters, they begin with a story worth discovering. If your players genuinely want to know what happens next, you've already accomplished the hardest part. Everything else, combats and puzzles and negotiations and exploration and those inevitable moments when somebody tries to adopt the monster instead of fighting it, is simply the adventure unfolding from there. The next thing I want to talk about is motivation, because this is where so many otherwise excellent quests quietly wander into the swamp, get distracted by mushrooms, and never quite find their way home. Every quest begins with somebody wanting something. That sounds ridiculously obvious, but it's amazing how often we skip that question entirely. The village needs saving. Okay. Why? The merchant wants protection. Great. From whom? The queen wants an artifact recovered. Wonderful. What happens if she doesn't get it? Every objective should exist because somebody desperately wants something to change. Once you understand what people want, the rest of the quest practically starts building itself, much like this miniature after another careful addition of color that has finally tied some of the previous layers together. Players also appreciate feeling like they discovered the adventure instead of having it dropped directly into their laps by an enthusiastic non-player character wearing what I like to call the "please accept my quest" expression. You know exactly the face I'm talking about. They stand perfectly still in the tavern. They have no hobbies, no friends, no apparent need for food or sleep. They simply exist until adventurers walk within conversational distance. Then suddenly it's heroes! Thank goodness you've arrived! Meanwhile, the players are thinking, we've been in town for 6 minutes. How do you know we're heroes? We haven't even accidentally broken anything yet. Instead, let quests emerge naturally from the world. Maybe the players overhear an argument in the marketplace. Perhaps they notice hunters returning far earlier than expected with obvious signs of panic. Maybe they stop at an inn where everyone keeps lowering their voices whenever a particular family name comes up. None of these scenes are screaming, "Adventure starts here!" They're simply showing that something unusual is happening. Curiosity usually does the rest. Players love believing they found the mystery on their own, even if you gently nudge them toward it like a helpful goblin with surprisingly good customer service. Another thing worth remembering is that players rarely care about your notes. I know, it hurts. You spent 3 evenings inventing the royal genealogies stretching back 1,200 years, complete with 6 succession crises and 1 important goat. Your players? They immediately ask the stable boy what his favorite pie is. Congratulations. The stable boy now has more personality than the king because you improvised an answer. That's not failure. That's tabletop gaming. The world comes alive wherever the players decide to shine their flashlight. And sometimes that flashlight is pointed directly at the least prepared corner of your notebook. One of my favorite techniques is giving important characters something memorable that has absolutely nothing to do with the quest itself. Maybe the town guard collects polished seashells despite living hundreds of miles from the coast. Maybe the librarian constantly sneezes whenever somebody lies. Maybe the elderly herbalist has a pet crow that interrupts every serious conversation with spectacularly terrible timing. These details don't need mechanical importance. They're simply memorable. Players remember personalities much better than job descriptions. Ask someone months later whether they remember Captain Roland, and maybe they don't. Ask whether they remember the guard obsessed with seashells, and suddenly everyone starts laughing. As I'm talking, I'm slowly adding some detail to this corrupted brute. Nothing overwhelming. Just enough to suggest a little bit about his background, and maybe shed some light on where he's been using light and contrast. That's another wonderful lesson for world building. Contrast makes everything stronger. A terrifying monster looks even more frightening when tiny signs of ordinary life still exist nearby. Likewise, peaceful moments in your campaign make dangerous moments feel genuinely dangerous, because players have something worth protecting, instead of just existing in permanent catastrophe mode. Let's discuss player agency, because this phrase gets thrown around constantly, but it's sometimes explained in a way that sounds much more mysterious than it really is. Player agency simply means their choices matter. That's it. Not every choice, not every conversation, certainly not every attempt to convince the dragon that taxes are voluntary. But meaningful decisions should create meaningful differences. If every path eventually reaches exactly the same room, with exactly the same villain saying exactly the same speech, players eventually notice they're riding an invisible railroad. Nobody enjoys discovering the tracks after they've already bought the ticket. Now, that doesn't mean preparing 1,200 different storylines because your players might decide to investigate literally every barrel in existence. Please don't do that to yourself. You'll collapse somewhere beneath an avalanche of color-coded index cards while muttering about Grange storage logistics. Instead, prepare situations rather than scripts. Know what the villain wants. Know what important characters are trying to accomplish. Know what happens if nobody interferes. Then let the players interfere. They're remarkably good at inventing solutions that no reasonable human being could possibly have anticipated, including solutions involving chickens far more often than statistical probability would suggest. Speaking of unexpected solutions, never underestimate how much players enjoy feeling clever. A quest doesn't become memorable simply because the enemies have more hit points. It becomes memorable because the players found an unexpected way to overcome a challenge. Maybe they negotiated peace between rival factions. Maybe they collapsed a bridge instead of fighting an entire army. Maybe they convinced two monsters that they were actually co-workers and should unionize before attacking adventurers. The details don't matter nearly as much as giving people opportunities to solve problems creatively. Players don't remember doing what the dungeon master expected. They remember surprising everyone, including themselves. Here's another trap that's surprisingly easy to fall into. Don't hide essential information behind a single dice roll. We've all seen it happen. The rogue rolls a natural 2 while investigating the suspicious altar. Well, I guess nobody learns anything, campaign over. That's not satisfying. Important clues should be discoverable, even if nobody can roll anything higher than a 3. Dice rolls should determine how quickly information is found, what additional details are uncovered, or what complications arise during the investigation. Failure should move the story sideways, rather than stopping it completely. Nothing kills excitement faster than an entire evening ending because somebody briefly became allergic to rolling anything above a 6. As I continue adding details to this miniature, the sculpt suddenly develops depth that wasn't obvious before. That's exactly how secrets should work in a campaign. They shouldn't exist just because hidden information is fashionable. Secrets should deepen everything around them. When players uncover the truth, previous events should suddenly make more sense. Oh, that's why the mayor kept avoiding the chapel. That's why nobody would fish in the eastern lake. Those moments are incredibly satisfying because the revelation doesn't replicate the story. It recontextualizes it, making earlier scenes feel richer rather than random. One of the funniest habits players have is assuming absolutely everything must be connected. Introduce 3 unrelated events, and within minutes, someone announces, obviously the baker, the haunted scarecrow, and the disappearing turnip are all working together. Sometimes I just sit there silently because their conspiracy board is genuinely fascinating. Occasionally, it's better than my original idea. Other times, it's gloriously, magnificently wrong. Either way, they're engaged. They're discussing possibilities. They're paying attention to details. Those conversations around the table are pure gold because they mean the players have emotionally invested themselves in figuring out your world instead of waiting for the next combat encounter. The best quests rarely feel like isolated episodes. Instead, they feel like chapters in a living world that's continuing whether the heroes happen to be standing there or not. Maybe the merchant they rescued 3 adventures ago now owns a thriving business and happily gives them discounts. Maybe the grumpy dwarf they accidentally offended still refuses to speak to them, except through increasingly sarcastic handwritten notes. Maybe that tiny goblin they spared has become an unexpectedly competent local leader. These callbacks reward attention, reinforce continuity, and make the setting feel wonderfully alive. After all, if players remember the world, they'll care about protecting it. And that's when you've truly crafted a quest they won't soon forget. The other ingredient that separates an unforgettable quest from a forgettable one is pacing. Think about pacing the same way you think about painting a miniature. If I covered this entire model in the darkest black I own, we'd technically have paint on the figure, but it wouldn't be very interesting. Likewise, if every single minute of a quest is combat, eventually combat stops feeling exciting. Players need breathing room. They need opportunities to joke with each other, explore a strange location, argue over a questionable plan, or become emotionally attached to a goat that absolutely was not supposed to become part of the campaign. Those quieter moments aren't interruptions. They're the foundation that makes the exciting moments shine brighter. One of my favorite session structures is what I jokingly call the roller coaster method. Start with something intriguing, build some tension, give everyone a chance to laugh, increase the danger, offer a small victory, reveal that the victory created an entirely different problem. Let everyone catch their breath again before the next climb begins. Notice that nowhere in that structure did I say, fight 6 identical groups of skeletons in consecutive rooms. Variety keeps players engaged because they never feel like they're repeating yesterday's encounter with slightly different wallpaper. While I'm talking, I'm adding more layers over parts of this corrupted brute. I have to be careful that he's not too bright because he's obviously a swampy, gross creature, but also that he's not so dark that he just disappears. I want to reclaim those raised surfaces so the creature doesn't suddenly become a dark silhouette. Campaign design works exactly the same way. You constantly move between broad strokes and fine details. Sometimes you're focusing on kingdoms and ancient prophecies. Sometimes you're deciding that one cracked boot outside an abandoned cabin tells a surprisingly emotional story. Both scales matter, and switching between them keeps the world feeling enormous without becoming overwhelming. Now let's discuss one of the greatest temptations facing every dungeon master: the irresistible desire to explain absolutely everything. Resist it. Mystery is wonderful. If players walk into an ancient ruin, they do not necessarily need a 20-minute lecture explaining every dynasty that occupied it over the past 3,000 years. Instead, let the environment raise questions. Strange carvings, broken statues, a throne that faces the wrong direction. Let the players investigate because they want answers rather than because they're trapped in what feels suspiciously like a fantasy history lecture disguised as role-playing. This also means trusting your audience. Your players are usually much smarter than we give them credit for. They'll connect clues. They'll notice recurring symbols. They'll remember that odd little detail you mentioned 3 sessions ago while you were convinced nobody even heard it. They'll also occasionally invent connections that exist nowhere except their own wonderfully chaotic imaginations, but that's half the fun. Good storytelling leaves room for the audience to participate. A campaign shouldn't feel like listening to someone read a novel aloud. It should feel like discovering the story together, one wonderfully questionable decision at a time. Let's talk about quest hooks for a moment, because not every player bites the same bait. Some players love treasure. Others immediately volunteer to rescue innocent people. Some hear the words "forbidden library" and suddenly forget they had other plans. Others simply want to see what happens if they push the suspicious magical button that everyone else widely agreed to avoid. The more different motivations your hook touches, the more likely somebody around the table becomes invested immediately. If one player cares, they'll often drag the rest of the party along with contagious enthusiasm, usually accompanied by increasingly dramatic hand gestures. One thing I've learned after years around tabletop games is that players almost never remember numbers. They don't fondly reminisce about earning exactly 327 gold pieces. They remember moments. They remember accidentally convincing a troll to become the village baker. They remember defeating a terrifying monster with an improvised plan involving flour, rope, and a suspiciously enthusiastic donkey. They remember the cleric rolling a nat 1 during an inspiring speech and somehow making everyone less confident than before. When you're designing quests, chase the memorable moments rather than the perfect mathematical balance. Numbers fade, but stories linger for years. I'm adding just a few more touches across this rough miniature now, making sure to get that texture to leap forward. I think I'm going to avoid dry brushing this mini, because dry brushing is one of those techniques that feels like cheating, because suddenly everything looks dramatically better after about 30 seconds of work, and I actually don't want this guy to look better. World building has its own version of dry brushing. Tiny recurring details make the setting feel consistent with surprisingly little effort. Maybe every temple burns blue candles. Maybe travelers greet one another with the same phrase. Maybe ravens always seem to appear before major historical events. These recurring details quietly stitch your world together until it feels like a place with traditions, instead of a collection of disconnected locations. Another incredibly powerful tool is allowing failure to create new adventures instead of ending existing ones. Imagine the party fails to stop thieves from stealing an important relic. The boring outcome is, well, you failed. The exciting outcome is now the thieves have escaped. Neighboring kingdoms become suspicious. Rival treasure hunters enter the race, and suddenly everyone is chasing the same artifact across the continent. Failure generated momentum. Some of the greatest campaign stories begin with spectacular disasters. In fact, if your table never experiences the occasional glorious catastrophe, are you even playing tabletop games correctly? Let's be honest for a second. Some of the most entertaining moments at any gaming table happen because the dungeon master loses complete control of the situation. You prepared an elegant diplomatic negotiation. The barbarian challenges the ambassador to an arm wrestling competition. You prepared a tense stealth mission. Somebody loudly asks whether ghosts appreciate interpretive dance. You lovingly crafted an intricate murder mystery. The wizard spends 45 minutes trying to befriend the suspect's pet turtle instead. You know what? Lean into it. Those wonderfully chaotic detours often become the stories everyone remembers longest because they belong uniquely to your table and couldn't have happened anywhere else. As a painter, I've learned that sometimes the miniature tells me what it wants next. I might have planned to highlight one section, only to realize another area needs attention first because the balance isn't quite right. Campaigns behave similarly. Maybe you expected the mysterious runes to become the centerpiece of the adventure, but your players absolutely adore the eccentric herbalist you invented in 12 seconds because someone unexpectedly asked where healing potions came from. That's perfectly okay. Follow the excitement. Enthusiasm is one of the best compasses a storyteller can have, even if it occasionally points toward directions you never expected to travel. Here's something else worth remembering. Quests don't have to be difficult to be meaningful. Sometimes the objective is simply making someone's day a little bit better. Escorting an elderly scholar safely through dangerous woods. Helping a young dragon learn why accidentally setting taverns on fire is generally considered poor manners. Maybe finding musicians' lost instrument before an important festival. These quieter adventures provide emotional variety while reminding everyone that heroism isn't measured exclusively by the size of the monster you're fighting. Sometimes being a hero means making the world just a little kinder than you found it. I'm finally starting to get somewhere on this corrupted creature. Not far enough. There's a lot to be done, but you can start to see the lingering corruption and the ancient magic simmering beneath the surface. It's amazing how one carefully placed accent color suddenly changes the entire mood of the model. Stories have accent colors too. A single heartfelt conversation, one unexpected betrayal, a moment of genuine forgiveness. These emotional highlights don't need to happen constantly. In fact, they're stronger when used sparingly. Save them for the moments that truly matter, and your players will remember them long after they've forgotten exactly how many goblins were hiding behind that suspiciously decorative barrel. The final thing I want to leave you with is this. Players don't fall in love with quests because they're perfectly balanced. They fall in love with quests because they feel like they matter. That's an incredibly freeing realization as a dungeon master. It means you don't need every encounter to be mathematically flawless. You don't need every villain to have 15 pages of backstory. You don't need every dungeon to contain 17 puzzles and 4 secret passages and a dragon with an advanced degree in architecture. You simply need to give your players something worth caring about. Once they care, They'll forgive an occasional awkward encounter, an imperfect map, or the fact that you accidentally gave two different innkeepers exactly the same voice. We've all been there. I've had entire campaigns where every NPC has exactly the same voice because I'm just done trying to do voices. Just the way it goes. Now, one exercise I recommend is asking yourself one simple question before introducing any quest. Why would the players tell this story 6 months from now? Notice I didn't ask whether they'll complete it. Most quests get completed. That's easy enough. The better question is whether they'll remember it. Maybe they'll remember the impossible decision they had to make. Maybe they'll remember the hilarious misunderstanding that somehow prevented a war. Maybe they'll remember the tiny kobold who insisted on being addressed as Assistant Regional Dragon. If you can already imagine your players laughing about the adventure months later, you're probably building something special. Something else worth embracing is the idea that not every mystery needs an answer. I know that sounds strange after spending an entire video talking about curiosity, but hear me out. Sometimes it's perfectly fine for players to leave a place wondering. Maybe they never discover who carved those impossible runes deep beneath the mountain. Maybe they never learn why one lonely lighthouse keeps shining despite having no keeper. Maybe an old traveler tells a story that nobody can ever confirm or deny. Leaving a few unanswered questions makes the world feel larger than the campaign itself. After all, no one knows every secret of a real world, so why should a fantasy one feel completely solved? Besides, it gives you the opportunity to return to that world and solve some of those mysteries later. By this point, this corrupted miniature is really starting to come together. The browns have warmed everything up. The blacks settled deeply into the deepest recesses. The grays have defined the stone and weathered textures. The greens have made the base feel alive, despite the horror standing on top of it. And those little hints of red are doing exactly what I hoped they would. Not shouting for attention. They're whispering, "Something terrible happened here." That's one of my favorite things in miniature painting. Every layer changes the story just a little, and by the end you've built something that couldn't have existed if you'd skipped any of the earlier steps. Campaigns grow exactly the same way. Don't pressure yourself into creating perfection before the first session even begins. Let the campaign develop one layer at a time. Introduce interesting people. Add memorable places. Sprinkle in mysteries. Watch what excites your players. Expand those ideas. If they become fascinated by the haunted lighthouse instead of your carefully prepared volcano dungeon, wonderful. Apparently you're running a lighthouse campaign now. Congratulations. Buy yourself another notebook and pretend this was always the master plan. The beautiful thing about tabletop games is that they aren't finished products. They're living stories, constantly reshaped by the imaginations gathered around the table. I also think it's important to remember that every table is different. Some groups adore political intrigue, where every conversation feels like verbal chess. Others want glorious dungeon crawls packed with monsters, traps, and enough treasure to require several spreadsheets. Some want heartfelt role-playing. Others would happily spend 4 straight hours arguing over whether it's technically legal to launch a halfling with a catapult. None of these groups are playing it correctly. Your job isn't to design the perfect quest for every player on Earth. It's to design quests that fit the wonderful collection of weird, creative people sitting around your own table. Don't be afraid to ask your players what they enjoy either. We sometimes act like that ruins the magic, but it really doesn't. If someone tells you they love ancient ruins and mysterious curses, moral dilemmas, nautical adventures, or giant mushrooms with suspicious personalities, you've just received free inspiration directly from your audience. That's incredibly useful information. You're not spoiling the campaign by listening. You're increasing the odds that the next adventure speaks directly to the things your friends genuinely find exciting. Good storytelling isn't about showing everyone how clever you are. It's about creating an experience everyone enjoys together. And here's one final reminder for anyone feeling intimidated by experienced dungeon masters online. Every single legendary storyteller you admire has run awkward sessions. They've forgotten NPC names. They've accidentally contradicted themselves. They've looked down at their notes only to realize the important page was still somehow sitting on the kitchen table next to yesterday's coffee mug. Experience isn't the absence of mistakes. Experience is becoming comfortable turning mistakes into opportunities. Sometimes the funniest running joke in an entire campaign begins because the dungeon master completely forgot what color the dragon was supposed to be. And that's okay. As I finish the very last of this monstrous fellow, I'm reminded why I enjoy combining miniature painting with conversations like this. Painting rewards patience. Storytelling rewards patience too. Neither one becomes remarkable because you rush through it. Layer after layer, decision after decision, color after color, conversation after conversation, they slowly become something greater than the individual pieces. That's true whether you're painting a terrifying corrupted giant, creating a memorable village full of eccentric characters, or designing a quest your players will still be talking about years from now. Great adventures aren't assembled all at once. They're patiently crafted until they feel alive. So the next time you're preparing a session, don't start by asking yourself how many monsters should guard the treasure room. Start by asking yourself, who cares about what's happening? Who's afraid? Who's hopeful? Who stands to lose everything? Who desperately needs help but doesn't know where to find it? Those questions create stories. Stories create emotional investment. Emotional investment creates unforgettable quests. The combat, the treasure, the maps, the miniatures, and all the wonderfully dramatic dice rolls become the tools that bring those stories to life. That's the real magic of tabletop gaming. And it's one of the reasons so many of us keep coming back to the table year after year. That's about it for today. I'd love to hear about the quest your players still talk about years later, or maybe the adventure that completely surprised you as a dungeon master, because your group took it somewhere you never expected. Share your favorite stories down in the comments. I genuinely enjoy reading them, and they might even inspire a future video. I hope you'll be back with us next time. Bye!